Now this is a tactical knife. Embark with me on this journey as we forge it from scratch with nothing but a sketch and a dream to make the ultimate everyday carry knife. Alright, so now that the fire has been lit, it's time to start forging the blade. For this, I'm going to be referencing a sketch that I made with the client, as well as picking out a piece of 15 and 20 steel. Now this steel is a little bit too thin for my liking. What this means is I'll have to forge it delicately and make sure that I don't cause any cold shuts from steel rolling over on itself. I'm going to begin doing this by drawing down the tip of the blade. For this, I'm going to strike it on an angle and pinch it down into a small Christmas tree looking shape. Once this has been done, I'm going to use a hot cutting tool to make the isolation for our tang. Because this is a full tang knife, I have to be very careful that I don't draw the tang out too thin. Ultimately, I'm going to leave it a little bit thicker than I usually would, and that's so that I have plenty of room to grind in the shape later. I'm using forging here more as a means to stretch the material where I need it, rather than try to forge it to its final shape. Alright, so now that forging's been done, it's time to normalize the blade. Now if you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know what normalizing is. But essentially I'm just heating it up 3 times to specific temperatures, and this prepares the steel for quenching. Alright, so now that's been normalized 3 times, what I'm going to do is let that cool down and then we're going to shape it. Now I went ahead and forged another knife, but that is for a different video altogether. That's actually a practice piece for another video, but again, gonna let this cool down and then I get to shape it, but just wanted to mention that because that is a really cool project and I can't wait to make a video on that. Okay, so what I did is using the reference drawing, I sketched that out onto our blank here. Now I'm gonna go to the grinder and start to rough in this profile. If you have an angle grinder, this works as well. I'm gonna be using the belt grinder that's most convenient for me. Let's make some noise! Woo! Now as per usual, I'm gonna go in here with a lower grit belt that's pretty worn, and that'll allow me to knock off a lot of that scale on the profile. I wanna get this pretty much 99% finished before heat treating, as there's aspects that I'm gonna be using a file for. One of these is creating the little sharpening choil at the base of the blade. This helps to ease the transition from the handle to the edge of the knife. Once that's been cut in, I'm going to add our recurve to our blade. Something I usually don't talk about is when you add a recurve to a blade, it actually makes it pretty difficult to sharpen. Hey, I think it looks pretty cool though. The next step is to create the finger hole on the bottom of the handle. I couldn't really think of any better way of doing this rather than just drilling some holes and using a file to make some light passes until it was a perfect circle. Alright, so now that it has been completely profiled, I'm going to stop here before heat treating. What I'm going to do next is drill out the holes on our scales. This is because when I heat treat it, I don't want to risk accidentally hardening that part and not being able to drill it out later. So I'm going to go ahead, drill a couple holes, and that'll allow me then to prepare it for heat treating. Let's do that. Time for quench! Woo! Now as per usual, I'm going to preheat a bucket of Parks 50 quench oil. Now, this is your daily reminder to keep your piece submerged when you're quenching it so you don't have this happen. Now that our oil has been preheated though, it's time to quench the blade. For this I'm going to bring it up to the critical temperature before putting in the oil and oscillating it back and forth. Once this has been done, I'm going to quickly throw it in the jaws of my post vise, that way as it cools down it stays as straight as it possibly can be, before temper. Alright, so now that the blade has been quenched and tempered, now the only thing that's left to do is to grind it and polish it, so let's do it. Alright, so after I've gotten the handle flattened off, the next thing you're going to see me do is something a little different. I'm going to be using a fullering tool to essentially carve out some of the material underneath the handle scales. This is partially done for weight loss. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the blade before I carve in my bevels. The reason that you carve a fuller in before bevels is so that if you have any sort of discrepancy in the outline of your fuller, when you carve bevels, this will actually bring that border back. You use this as a tool to fine-tune the shape of the overall grind. This is something that Matt Stagmer once said that is especially important on swords and larger projects. Alright, so the blade has been about 95% finished. So for the handle, I'm using Cocobolo hardwood scales. Now the first step is I need to now split them down the middle to create 2 pieces of scale. Typically I would use a bandsaw or a table saw for this matter. What I wanted to do is quickly explain why I'm in a different workshop and why I don't have access to a bandsaw or table saw anymore. So you've seen me sort of bounce around from workshop to workshop over the past couple of videos, and the reason is that the other workshop that I work in, which is a much larger workshop and has much nicer tools, is actually where I grew up. However, the past couple of years I've had a hard time because that's about 2 hours away from me right now. So that means that I could only film videos and make stuff on the weekends. And even at that, it was only every couple weekends. Now, thankfully, I've been able to move part of my workshop out to my apartment. And this has been an absolute critical thing to be able to create more videos and create more knives. So moving forward, if you see me randomly appear in a larger, much nicer woodworking workshop, that's why. All right, so the next step is to fit up the handle scales to the knife. For this, I'm going to find a drill bit that's a little bit smaller than the pin stock I'm using. Then from there, I'll drill out the holes. All right, so now that both scales have been fitted up, the next step is to rough profile them with the handsaw before using the belt grinder. Let's keep moving. Let's do it. Alright, now that the profile has been cut out mostly on the belt grinder, I'm going to go ahead and glue the scales on, and this will allow me to finalize the profile once the glue's dried. I want to make sure I get all the glue at the top of the knife cleaned up, as I won't be able to touch this up later. So that's a real concern right now. It's just making sure this gets all cleaned up here at this transition. Once the glue has been dried, now we can start to shape our scales. For this, we're going to start with the profile and knock off the excess squeeze out of the glue. From there, I can start to work down the scales into a more manageable shape for holding. I'm going to start by knocking off the corners to make this sort of triangular cross section before I take it down to a flat surface on the grinder. And then the next step is to round everything over, first with the belt and then by hand. Alright, so now the knife has been pretty much shaped, and I would stop here. However, the customer wants some scalloping done to the handle. That way, if it's a wet environment or if there's any sort of grease or sweat on your hands, you still have a good grip. So what I'm going to do is put up the small wheel attachment on belt grinder, and we're going to go through and basically add little indentations across this handle scale. So let's go ahead and do that. So far, I'm really liking this thing. Alright, so the knife is almost finished. I want to stop here before I put the final finish on the blade, as I want to make a sheath. Now the customers requested this is going to be an in-pocket sheath. That being said, it's not going to go in your belt loop like you typically would have. Instead, it's actually going to slide down in the pocket and be concealed. That being said, we need to make a very slim sheath, and for that, I also have this really cool ulti-clip that I'm going to be using as the method of attachment to the pocket. So I'm going to go ahead, show some leather work action, as I usually don't show sheath work. But I hope you guys enjoyed this, and yeah, let's make a pretty cool sheath. Alright, so the first step is we got to make all of our patterns. This consists of 2 main pieces, a welt, as well as a little pocket that I'll make in order to hold the ulti clip. Once these get cut out, the next step then will be laying out our punching. After using a pair of calipers to mark out an even spacing around the outside borders of the pieces, I'm going to go through and stamp our stitching marks. Once these have been stamped on each piece, the next step is to decorate with some stamping. I'm going to be going with a basic basket weave pattern here, but there are many different stamps you can get for sheath making. After all this has been done, we're going to stitch on the first part, which is the ulti clip. After this, we're going to contact cement the welt, and we're going to apply it to our 2 main pieces. It's important to let the contact cement completely dry before you place the parts together. Once it is dry though, you're going to use a hammer to tap it, and that'll set the glue. After all this has been done, it's just time to hand stitch the sheath. This is by far the most time consuming part, but it's really cool to see every piece start to come together. there you have it. That build is completely wrapped up. If you'd like to get in contact with me to make a custom knife, shoot me an email over at enzforge@gmail.com. That allows me and you to have an in-depth conversation on design and what I can make to fit your specifications. Now, if you like this video, like and subscribe so maybe you get to see more content from me in the future. Thank you so much, and God bless. All right, goodbye.